But I think what I heard you say was that birds talk to each other. We can learn to understand it, and it's fun. Welcome to the Tracking Connections podcast, and thanks for listening.
We feature voices from around the world, sharing stories of working intentionally with deep nature connection in ways that transform lives, families, projects, and communities. I'm Sarah.
I'm Aidan.
And I'm John.
And we are your hosts from Living Connection First. Hey, everybody, this is Aidan.
This is Sarah, and we're here to talk about bird language and what the birds tell us about what's on the landscape. I'm going to pass it over to John, who wrote What the Robin Knows, a book about bird language. So thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody. I was involved in writing What the Robin Knows starting in the early 2000s. And I was working with Dan Gardoki, who is the science editor for What the Robin Knows, How the Birds Reveal the Secrets of the Natural World. And Dan and I were doing kind of independent research literature review, like trying to find, who has written about bird language. Tom Brown had written about it in kind of general terms and talking about concentric rings, like if you drop a rock in a pond and it sends out ripples. If a hawk flies in, it sends out ripples. That's how he described it, but he didn't give super detailed patterns. I mean, I knew he knew them because he's the one who taught it to me. So I can't fault him for not writing about it. But it was interesting for us because we were trying to find someone who we could point to in writing literature who had actually written about it in a coherent way. And I was surprised to find that there was almost nothing in the early 2000s published by anybody. The only person I found was the writer Jim Corbett, who wrote about, he's famous for his man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag and temple tiger. And, he was back in the last century and he's now an ancestor. He was a friend of one of my friends, Ingwe. But Corbett actually explained in vivid detail that, when the sambor said this and the chital deer said that and the monkey said this, that he knew it was a leopard or he knew it was a tiger. And he had very specific explanations, what the various birds were saying that told them it was a snake, versus a this or that. I'm like, oh, somebody knows this stuff and put it out there. And now he's not here with us anymore. Why isn't it out there? Why don't people know it? And I dove really deep into this subject with Dan. I mean, we had generated well over 300,000 words, which is more than 3 times what we could fit in a trade book, What the Robin Knows. And we had gone so deep into it that I think that I kind of lost my ability to communicate about it with people in the world outside of my city area. And so I was at an Audubon conference after my book had come out, and a couple of the board members of the Audubon Society said, can you please give us an idea of what you're going to do in this workshop at this conference? And so I happily got into it and explained all this stuff, and I told one cool story after the next. And one of the board members, Joe Ellis, who at that time was working with marketing at Goldman Sachs, right? So he's super good at communication in terms of how the public would receive it. He says to me, John, that first story you told had me on the edge of my seat. And it went on for 5 minutes and I was so excited and I wanted to talk to you about what you just said, but then you moved on to another amazing story and then another amazing story. And pretty soon I lost the whole plot and I'm now completely confused. But I think what I heard you say was that birds talk to each other. We can learn to understand it and it's fun. I said, well, yeah, actually, I kind of did say that. He said, well, why didn't you just say that? And then the other board member, Holt Thrasher, said, John, just want you to know that Joe Ellis is famous for breaking complex things down into 3 things. So, don't take it personally. That's just what Joe does. But I thought, okay, so that's where I want to start with you all. It's like, gosh, it wasn't in our culture. It's not in our literature, right? It's not in our everyday conversation. Now there's a few books out there on it. George Buin put out a lovely book that I wrote the forward to, Eavesdropping on Animals. That came out more recently. George is one of our podcast guests a few episodes ago. Bird language is catching on, right? People are now engaging with it. They're talking about it. It's starting to show up in the culture. And there's a bunch of science now on it as well. The science has been flourishing in the last few years, especially with people doing innovative things with audio recordings and AI analysis of the audio recordings. I think of the man who did that amazing work with the prairie dogs, Khan, whose last name I cannot pronounce. I'm sorry. We'll put it in the show notes if you want to find a link to his incredible research, which said, not only are prairie dogs alarming, but they're alarming very specifically. Like the computer broke down thousands and thousands of hours of audio patterns that were coupled with graduate students' field observations. So they're watching the prairie dog colony, and if they see a coyote coming from the west and trotting by, these prairie dogs, the computer deciphered, they weren't just saying, get out of here, a predator. They were saying, it's a coyote. They were saying, it's a coyote trotting. It's a coyote hunting, right? And it's that specific. And he even went so far as to say that these prairie dogs are making sounds when he's arriving wearing a red jacket, and they're literally able to say, the researcher Khan is arriving, he's walking up and he's wearing a red jacket. I mean, they were that specific in their language. And for us, what we hear is these chips and squeaks, right? That don't sound like language to us. I got to work with Dr. Katie Sieving from a university in Florida who did tens of thousands of hours of field recordings on the tufted titmouse, which she came to call the sentinel of those woods in Florida, because it would say specific things about a red-tailed hawk, specific things about a great horned owl, different things about Cooper's hawk, different things about ground predators. And she identified a whole bunch of specific, words and phrases that were absolutely provable. It's out there now, right? People are talking about it. People are practicing it. People are pushing the edges of it. I learned it in a very particular way, which we'll bring to you, by the end of this particular episode. We want you to be able to do this in your own backyard, right? You can learn that birds talk to each other. We can learn to understand it. And it is really, really fun. So I was sitting with a friend of mine about 15 years ago, maybe 14 years ago. I can't remember the exact date. I was visiting him at his home in South Africa. And he lives on the, at the very tip of the Western Cape, very much close to the Cape Point Nature Reserve. And he and his wife have this little lovely house up on the side of a hill, modest little place, and beautiful, plants growing around it and such. And there's a forested landscape around that, and up a mountain that's kind of rocky and gravelly. And then down below them, it goes down to the sea, down to the False Bay. And this man is a great tracker. He's a great naturalist, very, very, very experienced in the wilderness. And we were just sitting on his patio, and he'd been living there for a while. Okay. So all of a sudden I noticed a series of bird alarms, very specific. The birds were flying really fast in a straight line, horizontal to the ground. Some of them were ditching and diving down into bushes. There was these loud calls that I felt in my gut had a lot of urgency in them. And I said out loud at that moment, I said, I don't know who these birds are, what species they are, but I can tell you right now that they're very agitated, and that if I was home, I would tell you, look over there, here comes a Cooper's hawk, which is a particular kind of hawk, a family of hawks, the accipiters, that specialize in catching songbirds on the wing, right? They are definitely the terror of the neighborhood. So this is not a subtle thing. You're all going to discover that in your own backyard. Every continent I've been on now has accipiters, and I have seen this pattern in every continent I've been to. Okay, Africa, Europe, Australia, North America. So they both looked in the direction I said it would come from. And his wife asked out loud, is a Cooper's hawk an accipiter? I said, yes, it is. She says, oh, yes, we have sparrowhawks here. That's what they call them there. And lo and behold, a few seconds later comes the sparrowhawk flying from that direction. And the husband says, I just can't believe you just did that. How did you do that? I've been living here. I consider myself an observant naturalist. I pay attention. I study wildlife. I'm an underwater diver. I'm constantly cataloging things. How did you do that? He said, I want to learn that. And I told him, well, I think all you have to do is sit on this nice patio you have every day for 20 minutes and just watch and listen and get to know the patterns. And so I explained to him a few things about how to learn bird language, how to know the difference between when birds are basically relaxed, they're feeding or they're singing, or they're preening themselves, fluffing their feathers up, and they look very relaxed and comfortable. And, feel like landscape feels really peaceful and comfortable. And you feel that way when they feel that way. That's, you'll get that felt sense from enough practice. Versus when birds become alarmed. Now, when they're alarmed, they're either silent with their necks stretched, looking in one direction, like almost like a popsicle, a birdsicle, Dan Gardoki called it. So that's the one extreme, the silent alarm of alertness, all the way up to them shouting at the top of their voice, "Get out of here, hide, we're about to die, the killer's arriving," right? So there's everything in between. So there is a continuum of alarm from, mild agitation to alert silence to absolute terror and shrieking at the last moment, right? So there's that continuum. But the switch gets thrown, and then there's this baseline pattern, which is, cue that music. Do 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 do, like that cartoon. Everything is beautiful, everything's perfect, everything's gentle and relaxed. So it's kind of like bird language is learning to recognize the difference between that baseline calm and the alarm. That's it. That's what you're doing. And you're getting to know it in the squirrels and the chipmunks here where we live, the towhees, the juncos, these are all songbirds I'm naming, the red-winged blackbird, the sudden flight of a mourning dove and the quills of the wings, the popping of turkeys. So you have characters in your yard that are there every day. And you get to know them in their calm state. And you get to know them when they're angry about the cat walking through, or when they suddenly go silent when a nest robber like a raven or a crow flies in. You begin to see these patterns and you just start to note them to yourself, And in so doing, you begin to learn the bird language. But it definitely requires getting to know the players in the play. You have to know them in all contexts. In the morning, in the evening, in the winter, in the summer. And it sounds like a lot of work, but it's actually very pleasant. What's unpleasant about sitting outside your door for 20 minutes, enjoying with questions in your mind, the breeze and the beautiful sunshine or the gentle rain, and, getting to know that birds act different in the rain than they do in the sun, different in the spring than the fall, blah, 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 right? You get the idea. So I laid that all out for this man. And his wife says, "Oh, he'll never do that. John, I know him too well. He can't sit still." He comes to me 2 days later and he says, "Could I do this whole thing underwater?" And I said, "Yeah, you actually could. There's this book called What the Robin Knows, that I published, and it's out there." I said, "But my friend Maureen McConnell at the Museum of Science in Boston sent me this magazine article. What the Sea Robin Knows was the title of it. And the sea robin is a fish I know from growing up on the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast of North America. And the sea robin was the one that always took your bait when you were flounder fishing, right? And so you're like, oh no, we've hit a school of sea robins. We should pull up the anchor and move to another location, right? So I knew the sea robin, and they were obviously making a play on words, and they did reference my book in the article, but they were talking about how all of the same principles that John is writing about in his book apply underwater, that divers have observed this. And when I was in the Hawaiian Islands, the Hawaiian people told me the same thing, that they had observed all the same patterns underwater that I described in my bird language workshop that they were attending. So he said, "I think I'm going to do this underwater. I'm going to have an underwater sit spot, and I'm going to sit there every day for at least an hour." And he didn't use a tank. He didn't use a wetsuit. He decided to go just in his bathing trunks with flippers, a snorkel, and a mask. And he went there every day for 10 years. He mapped the whole thing out in the way that we teach in bird language mapping. When you're trying to figure out, what the birds are doing, you're trying to see them from above and kind of make sense of how all the movements and sounds are in relation to each other. He did all that. He identified all the friends and creatures and things on the reef and in the sea forest there. And after 10 years of doing that, he befriended an octopus. And he developed this ability to move without creating ripples and disturbances, so that all the baseline life of the sea forest would just do its normal thing. And all the local creatures got used to him being there every day. And they began to reveal more and more secrets of this African sea forest, right? Because that's what you begin to notice with bird language. It is endlessly entertaining. And I think you now know that I'm talking about Craig Foster and my octopus teacher. This is a profound journey, and it starts out so simple. Birds talk to each other. We can learn to understand it, and it's fun. And beyond that fourth point that Joe Ellis made, it's deepening. As Sarah said, this book that I wrote is about deep bird language. In other words, it transforms us and how we move in the world. It's not just transactional observation. The squirrel does this, the fox does that. There's more to it than meets the eye. And you learn a lot about yourself, because the birds aren't just talking about, the hawk that's coming or the fox that's moving or the house cat that's creeping around. The birds are also talking about you. And I think we should all be curious. What are they saying about me? What's the biofeedback? And I love the fact that this is literal biofeedback, right? You're getting feedback from deer, squirrels, birds, later foxes, bobcats, etc., right? So I just wanted to lay that out. The best way to learn this is to learn it right outside your door. Absolutely.
Can you guys hear this?
Yeah. No, we just got charged. We just got fully charged by that thing.
So PG&E is here. They're doing their maintenance on the trees in our backyard. So we're talking about bird language, but really this is, interspecies communication, right? And as JY was just saying, the prairie dogs, can say very, very specific things. And I have been recently learning my dog's alarm call patterns. And he has a bunch of different patterns that he uses. His name is Hale. He's a Great Pyrenees. They are guard dogs through and through. That is their job. And there is a joke actually that says, because they're really stubborn. And if you tell your Pyrenees to come, you have to tell him 10 times to come or to sit. But in the meanwhile, he will hear a frog fart 3 miles away and start barking about it, So, so that's the baseline for them. But he's a guard dog, and he has figured out what our perimeter is. And so I have, because I work from home, I have started to study Hale's alarm call patterns, and he has a few distinct patterns. So first of all, he definitely has a threat level, and as you might expect, and is very stereotypical, the mailman is his sharp-shinned hawk, right? Is his Cooper's hawk, right? So for some reason, there's nothing more threatening than the mailman, which these days has been extended to the poor Amazon delivery guy or UPS driver, whoever that is. They are DEFCON 1 or DEFCON 5, whichever one's the biggest threat, right? So, but then he also, any strangers in utility trucks, he's going to just go absolutely nuts, and it's hard to calm him down at all. But then he has a couple other different ones. One of them is if someone is walking their dog past the front of our house and he'll be sleeping in the backyard, he will start barking about them going across the front of the house. And I can tell by sort of the intensity and the frequency of his barks whether he is hearing a dog walk past or whether he is hearing just people walking past, because the intensity changes depending on whether there's a dog present or not, right? And then there's this other one that I find really funny that actually just happened this morning, which is when someone is coming to visit who he knows, but they're not family members. And in this one, what'll happen is he starts with the intruder alarm, and then he runs towards the front door, but then he realizes who it is. And so then he kind of starts to he'll give a couple more barks just to be yeah. But then he starts to whine instead because he's excited to see his friend, and he's recognized that it's his friend, but he actually is trying to save face. He's trying to be I knew, I was just keeping you, So it's really amazing. But my favorite is that I can tell when the kids are coming home, because he knows who's family and, who's supposed to be coming home, and he recognizes their arrival. And so he'll be there sleeping on the floor, and I'm working on my computer. And then the next thing I know, I just see him kind of lifting up his head and starting to look around, and maybe getting up even to walk over. And I realize that it's him realizing that one of the kids is home. And it was amazing the other day. It happened at like 1 in the afternoon, and normally the kids aren't coming in until 3 or 3:30. And I went, oh, Hale is saying that the kid is home. And so I went to look, and sure enough, it was my eldest son who had had a test that day. And so he had early release, and I didn't know about that. And so Hale told me he was coming in the door, about 30 seconds before he arrived. So the bird language is just really cool, just that pattern. And for me, I almost have this sort of built-in sit spot practice because he is right near me all the time.
So Hale doesn't bark for the kids, or he barks differently?
He doesn't bark for the kids, but he does start to pay attention.
Yeah, so it just kind of shows you the nuance of possibility, not only of communication that we can learn to understand from having a relationship. Like, so Aidan is describing a relationship with his dog, who he spends all day with, right? So you're having a sit spot with Hale all day long at your workstation there. But then you're also learning that Hale isn't just a one-trick pony, right? He's got his, it turns out DEFCON 5 is normal peacetime conditions with low risk of conflict. So he's doing a DEFCON 5 for the family, right? But there's still a communication pattern that you recognize, Aidan, which that's a classic example. So yeah, don't think we have to go into the jungles of India to, walk with man-eating tigers with a guy like Jim Corbett to learn bird language. This is a great example of how it's not even outside your door, it's inside your door, right? It's just a way of seeing things, Critters talk to each other. We can learn to understand it, and it's fun. The only thing we have to do is make the choice to pay attention, right? And to set up time where we are in that intention with that attention, right? So that's awesome.
When I first heard about bird language, I was entirely intimidated because I assumed I would have to know which bird was making the sound, right? Like know the song. I thought that's what it meant. And I was like, not for me. That's way too much. And then, I started to understand, I would listen to John's talks and really appreciated like, oh, I can go with nuance and feeling. That makes so much sense. That's so much more accessible. I can totally do that. But what made me really pay attention was when I heard, not only will it tell you when the Cooper's hawk is coming, because, I thought that's pretty cool. Didn't motivate me the way that hearing that it would help me see more wild animals did. When I heard that, I was like, ooh, that's important. I really want to see more wild animals. I'm an avid wildlife tracker, spend a lot of time looking at animal footprints and following their trails around and asking lots of questions, and always want to see them, right? And rarely do. So that is why I took Backyard Birds, which is now an online course that we have available at Living Connection First. I took it about, maybe 10 years ago. It's been a while. And it's a great, very simple and accessible program. It takes you through daily exercises, and they're simple, right? So they're like bite-sized. So I go out and learn one of the shapes of alarm. So in What the Robin Knows, John talks about shapes of alarm, which is fascinating. It's super fascinating. So one is a parabolic alarm, which is shaped like an upside-down basket with the birds looking down into the bushes and alarming. And that is the alarm for a cat, right? And then there's things like a ditch, which is when the birds fly straight down from the tree because there's an aerial predator coming above them. And then there's the bullet, which is kind of like the shooting out, straight out, like running like crazy, flying like crazy because there's a predator, approaching at the same level. So I was super interested in all of that and loving the sensory experience, going out, sitting in nature at my sit spot and focused listening, right, on the birds and not worrying about who's who or seeing them, but listening and trying to feel, okay, what is baseline? what's normal and what is an alarm. Like that exercise in itself was, I don't know, it was like expanding my awareness in multiple directions all at once just did something really cool to me. I just really loved it. And it took me time to figure out what was an alarm and what was, I mean, often they're obvious, but they're not always, right? And like Aidan was talking about that nuance of alarm. The Buick's Wren taught me the nuance of alarm because I have the house cats. And, I'd hear the Buick's Wren alarm at like a moderate degree. And then one day I was hearing it like really, really alarming. Like they make that buzzing sound, which probably won't come through Zoom. So like would I hear a moderate, like a DEFCON 3 Buick's Wren would be like, zzz, zzz, zzz. And then one day I hear this like, like really persistent. And I look out and the Buick's Wren is hopping along the fence right above my house cat, looking straight down at him, like super angry. I know where you are. I know where you are. And I was like, cool. All right. So then, similar to Hale telling Aidan when the kids are coming home, the Buick's Wren would tell me when my cat was coming home. Like I caught that like repeatedly, from that point. Like I'd hear that alarm, look outside, and here comes Foxy, my cat. Within the first week of Backyard Birds, I went out for a sit and I had learned like 5 of the alarm shapes. And the task was to pay attention and map as many as you can. So I sit down and I've been there for about 5 minutes, quieting down my own mind and tuning in. And I'm expanding my listening out, listening to the birds in all the directions. And right in front of me, I see these little brown birds in the bushes. And I'm like, what are they doing? And I was just kind of relaxed watching them. They didn't seem to be doing anything particular. And then they were like gently alarming. And I was like, what's happening? And it was moving. There was like probably 4 or 5 birds. They were like looking down. They weren't alarming super strongly for some reason. And it was moving. And I was so perplexed. And then finally, the neighbor's house cat emerged out of the bushes. And I was like, no way. No way. That was a parabolic shape. It really looked like a parabolic shape. Oh, it was brilliant. Anyway, in the very next moment, so this cat's like moving away from me on my right side, then straight ahead in the field across from me, there's a ditch where a group of birds goes from the top of a tree to the ground. It's like a small apple tree. And so I see that. 1 second later, there's a huge gust of wind down the arroyo and a bullet coming the same direction of the gust of wind.
A bullet meaning a bird flying really fast in a straight line, not an actual metal bullet, folks.
That's right. The alarm shape of a bullet. That was coming from the same side of the field where the ditch had just happened. And so the ditch and then the bullet with the gust of wind, and right behind the gust of wind is a Cooper's hawk. And the Cooper's hawk landed on the fence behind me. I was absolutely mind blown. I was like, how? Like, I didn't have words. Like, I was literally stunned. Like, that was obviously the Cooper's hawk made that ditch happen. And then the Cooper's hawks like to follow gusts of wind because it masks their approach. So with that gust of wind came the Cooper's hawk, but the birds obviously were aware of it, or perhaps they reacted to the gust of wind, knowing that Cooper's hawks like to do that. Anyway, and then there was the Cooper's hawk above me on the fence. It was amazing. I can't promise that will happen if you do Backyard Birds, but to have that many alarm shapes happen and to be aware of them was like, I don't even know. It just totally changed my consciousness. And every time I would go out tracking, I was like, this is what's possible. And like John will tell you, this is happening all the time. And we don't have to look too hard for it. We don't have to look far for it. We just have to be aware and pay attention and know what we're even looking for. I remember being out tracking early in the morning in New Mexico in the desert. The sun had just risen And I had just started out for a wander to look for tracks. And as I crossed the road to go into the open desert, there was a Buick's wren alarming on a chumisa bush, which is about 4 feet tall and like 5 feet in diameter, and looking down into the bush. And it had that intense nuance that the Buick's wren at home had for my cat, for my house cat. And I checked it. I'm like, that's one of those intense alarms. So I very slowly approach this bush and the bird flies away. And I'm like looking around. I don't see anybody. And I'm like, okay, well, noted. I'll just take note of that. That was interesting. And I continued on a walk for like 5 miles and had been tracking fox and coyote. And on my way back to my car, I was on a bobcat trail. And the bobcat was walking from my car toward me, had been, right? So I was backtracking this bobcat. And it's walking down the road. And I'm about a mile from my car and where that bush was, where I heard the alarm. And I'm like, this bobcat, this is a fresh trail. And the bobcat's coming from the area of that bush where that alarm was. And I backtracked that bobcat all the way to that bush. So, I can't prove that Buick's wren was alarming at this bobcat that made that trail, but it makes sense. And then it makes you really think. Like, I examined that bush, right? Like, I looked all around it. Like, the invisibility factor of a bobcat to disappear like that really gives you a frame of reference, gave me a frame of reference for like what I'm up against, right? The scout skills of the wild animals are amazing. They could disappear into the desert, no problem. So yes, using the birds as our allies to see them, with a good mind, right? We want to see them because we love them, not because we want to disturb them. And maybe if I had approached that bush in a different way or stood for longer, maybe I could have watched that bobcat from a distance and enjoyed it. But the experience of it was just invaluable for me.
Man, there's so many fun little threads that come from that. I'm going to share one that is literally happening here in real time. So I have a bird feeder just outside the window here that I'm facing. It's about 5 feet from my window. And the laptop screen is between me and the feeder. So I kind of, get blocked from the birds. And I have these 5 finches that live in our front yard here, and they were happily feeding on the feeder. And then I grabbed my cup, which is a white ceramic cup, without really thinking about it. And I just picked it up real fast and went to take a sip. And they exploded off the feeder. They were just totally freaked out by that. And they flew off. And about 4 minutes later, the first one came back. And then a minute after that, the next 2 came back, and they sat above the feeder with their necks craned, and their cute little hair kind of went up too, their feathers in the back. So they looked like they had a little bit of a mohawk, and they were cocking their heads back and forth, and they were clearly looking for the danger that had scared them a few minutes ago and making sure it was all clear before they returned to the feeder. And then everybody returned to the feeder. But this is one of these things that happens, right? Is now that I have noticed that my sort of thoughtless drinking of tea scares the birds that I'm sharing space with, my instinct was immediately, oh man, I don't want to do that. And so then I actually tested it out. Can I sneakily move my mug and have a sip, right? Without scaring the finches off the feeder. And sure enough, it worked. And they were happily going about their business while I was drinking tea. And I think this also speaks to when we pay attention and we notice that these beings around us have these full inner lives, right? They're out there and they're living their whole complete lives as well, and they're watching out for danger and everything. We kind of befriend them, and you can't help but think, well, I want to be a good host to my friends. I want to be a good neighbor to my neighbors in the front yard, so to speak. And you develop this sense of empathy and this sense of wanting to care for the animals and the birds that live in your yard or live in your sit spot or live in your neighborhood, right? But I don't think we get a chance to develop that sensitivity and that empathy and that caring without the practice of awareness. right? And we have this concept of your awareness bubble and your disturbance bubble. And if you kind of think about the idea that you've got these two bubbles that are extending out around you at all times, and one of them is how far out around you you are paying attention, your awareness bubble, and then the other one is how far away from you you are causing disturbance. Well, if you can get your disturbance bubble to be smaller than your awareness bubble, you're going to get to have more fun in nature. But this doesn't just extend to the natural world, right? Where I'm going to, get to see more birds or get to enjoy the wildlife. It also extends to people, of course, right? That if I walk into a new space and I'm immediately leading with whatever it is I have on my mind or in my head, I'm much more likely to cause, a negative disturbance in that space than if I lead with awareness and asking the question, okay, what is going on here? What's the vibe here right now? And usually I find, at least, if I'm starting with awareness, this sort of instinct to want to be helpful and kind and caring towards the environment that I'm in sort of emerges naturally. So it starts with awareness for me. And I just think for me, that's a really, really important lesson that I've taken from the practice of bird language my whole life that has really helped me in every social situation that I find myself in, whether it's friends or family or professionally.
Yeah. So you're hearing really great, very, very down home stories here from Aidan and Sarah. And then Sarah pointing at the possibility of detecting more wildlife in the wilderness. And, of course, when you get around to reading Jim Corbett's books, you'll start to realize that he's using bird and animal language to find leopards and tigers that you cannot see with your eyes, right? And of course, if one of those tigers happens to be a man-eater, it's probably really good to know this if you're living in that place, right? I was intrigued by the fact that people getting killed or injured by lions and leopards in the Kalahari in Africa were never Bushmen. So the Bushmen are living there too, right? But when you read about these, tragedies, it's always people who are immigrants to the area, whatever culture they come from. And I was asking the Bushmen, how is it that you guys aren't helicopter parenting your children? Because, there's leopards, there's lions, there's hyenas, there's multiple species of deadly poisonous snakes, and there's a whole host of other wildlife hazards. And, what they explained to me was they're not worried about it because they cultivate the relationship, which they call, going from a thread to a string to a cord to a rope, with those wild beings, so that they, like hail, knows the difference between, the delivery driver or the utility company in the backyard, which caused the last eruption, versus the children, right? He has relationships with all those things and he can detect the difference. And so I wasn't like testing the Bushmen on their bird language knowledge, but I was spending 2 weeks focused entirely on bird language, not just the act of learning it from them, how do they teach it to their children, but also what are they capable of sensing on the landscape, these people, right? Because they don't have guns, they don't have chain link fences, they can't jump into a vehicle and slam the door. They're on foot, mostly barefoot. And, they have walking sticks, right? They're not in a place where they can have instant defense. Like the people who say, well, you're going into the wilderness, are you packing heat? You got your sidearm, right? Like that's the response if you don't have the awareness, right? It's like, well, I have to protect myself from these dangers. Well, the way the Bushmen protect themselves is by having incredible knowledge, incredible connection. And so I found the women in that community when they were off gathering bush food in this very huge wilderness area, they always knew where the lions were. And they were able to pinpoint the lion on the landscape for me every time. And the lion could be 2 miles away. I'm not kidding. So they kind of showed me what's possible. But the interesting thing about that group of people is that they all know this. So it's like your mom knows it, your dad knows it, your grandmother, your grandfather, your aunt, your uncle, your cousins, everybody knows this. So when they come back together around the fire at the end of the day, They're all sharing their intel stories that they receive from the landscape, which often includes bird and animal language, right? So, to see a culture that is so completely immersive in bird and animal language wisdom, and then to come back to a culture where it's now barely showing up in the culture now, right? It's just starting to show up, but you get to understand how nuanced your awareness can become. And as Aidan was talking about, what I learned from the bird and animal language, I now apply to people, right? I actually become a better version of myself because I'm not bursting into the scene, lifting my mug quickly and scaring all my compadres, right? I'm not, just sort of unburdening my frustration on the first person I run into. Instead, I'm putting my awareness way out and I'm feeling my way into the group of people that I'm entering, and that I'm much more sensitive and much more responsive. And, over the years, I've noticed that there's a high correlation of people who become very gentle, kind, responsive people and their bird language experience. Like there's a direct correlation there. So that's not an exaggeration in any way, shape, or form. One thing that, I would like to just speak to is that Sarah's story, when I first started mentoring her in tracking in bird language a number of years ago, and she told me the story of the Bewick's wren alarm, which she had already now learned from her cat, Foxy, right? So she now had this mental file card. This is what happens when a cat is moving on the landscape, right? Oh, could it be? Could it be? I can't prove it, right? I went around, looked around, I didn't see anything. But on my way back, I was backtracking really fresh bobcat tracks right to that bush. Did that really just happen? And how many times does that have to happen to us before we say, yeah, that is happening, right? And Sarah and I go on a mile-long walk around this landscape here, and we call it the Loop. And we have a place that we have nicknamed Bobcat Corner because every time we get to that corner while we're walking, there's always Bewick's wren alarms in that space. And then there's junco alarms and there's towhee alarms all in that same thicket, right? So Sarah takes it upon herself to go into the thicket, and then she finds bobcat tracks, she finds beds, she finds scat, so that place is now, it was so consistent. Every single time we walked around that place, there was what I call secondary alarms. The primary wave is Sarah and I approaching, and we're not making a huge amount of noise, and we're not, Sarah and I are both very careful to think like Aidan, let's move in a way that doesn't disturb our friends, our neighbors, right? We call that the honoring routine. So it's not like we're causing a panic for the bobcat, but clearly the bobcat is laying in this beautiful sunny bed on the edge of this hill where it has a really good view, and it's surrounded by thickets, so nothing can approach it without it knowing. We're probably also causing bird alarms, right? So the bobcat is getting early warning of our approach. And so what does the bobcat do? It gets up from its nap and it starts sneaking away. And if it had just stayed there and kept sleeping, the Bewick's wren wouldn't say a thing. But because it's now sneaking away from us, it's now causing, so Sarah and I are causing the bobcat to move. The bobcat's furtive movement, the way it's being sneaky, is causing the Bewick's wren to alarm, right? There's so many layers of nuance in that. But the other thing you'll notice is that a bobcat who's chill and licking his paws and just laying in the sun is not causing alarms. It's when the bobcat gets that sneaky body language that causes that intense alarm, right? One thing I want to just credit Dan Gardoki with, identifying the birdsicle shape. When a bird freezes out in the open because it's too late to escape the Cooper's hawk, its only last resort is to freeze. I want to credit him with that. And I also want to credit him with this continuum. He says the goal of bird language is to cause our awareness to become bigger than our disturbance. And when people first start on this journey, they wear their awareness close to their skin. Maybe they're just thinking the whole time, so they don't even have awareness outside their skin, right? So when our awareness is small, our disturbance is huge. The bigger our awareness, the smaller our disturbance. And they're absolutely mathematically linked, right? So as your awareness grows, your disturbance shrinks. And the more that happens, the more you start to have close encounters with wildlife that you've never had before. And that is not a coincidence. It is not a coincidence, right? There's a lot to this journey here.
I just wanted to share a success story where I actually got to see the animal. It's a simple story. I was out for a wander here on the landscape, not in Bobcat Corner, but in the Southwest Meadow here. And the California quail are very, very timid. They hang out in groups and you can hear them going, talking about you as you approach, and then they just explode and take off really fast and really loud and usually scare me as I'm walking. They're really great teachers on how to keep that low concentric ring as you're walking. And so I track that. Like I know how close I can get to the quail before they'll do that. And I always try to get a little bit quieter and, pass a little bit closer by. And this one day, there was a quail explosion on the far side of the meadow. And a couple minutes later, there was another one on another spot in the meadow. And I knew it wasn't me. And I also couldn't make sense of the movement. But what happened is it caused me to really pay attention and really slow down and really expand my awareness out. And finally, it was like the third or fourth explosion within maybe 7 to 10 minutes that I was able to see the bobcat hunting on the far side of the meadow. So that's one of those things where it was not a linear, like, oh, there's a parabolic alarm, there's a house cat, right? It was not that, but it was asking the question, being aware of movement on the landscape, and with that question, holding a particular awareness and then being rewarded purely through awareness and slowing down with being able to see the animal. So if your only takeaway from today is curiosity and maybe paying attention a little bit more to the birds, you still can get a lot out of bird language, and just let it be, something that you do gently as a habit and see what happens.
Great. And, the secret to it, if there is one, is to make it right outside your door while you're learning, because like Aidan's story with Hale and the goldfinches, this is stuff he knows and notices because he's going to the same place every day, all day, right? And that's the same with me. I keep my sit spot right out my door. And, you can learn so much from your neighbors. That's pretty much what it boils down to. And you will literally learn that your neighbor on foot walking their dog causes alarms, so not just the bird neighbors and not just the mammal neighbors, but also your human neighbors as well. So have fun with it, because it is really fun.
Yeah, it is amazing what starts to emerge when you mix curiosity with paying attention. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Tracking Connections. If you enjoy this podcast, it would mean a lot to us if you would take a minute to follow or subscribe. Following the podcast helps us, and it helps you, because you'll never miss an episode. We'd also love for you to give us a 5-star rating and review, and share an episode with a friend. To learn more about our current offerings, visit livingconnectionfirst.net. We'll see you next time.